Imagine that you are standing before a death sentence, but it does not come from a judge or an executioner in a public square. It comes in the form of a road. Before Jesus, or any traveler of the first century, took the first step outside the gates of Jerusalem towards Jericho, it was common for them to make peace with their family and, in many cases, settle their inheritances. They knew they were about to enter a corridor of 27 kilometers, where the mercy of God seemed not to reach the stone ground. You are not just leaving one city for another. You are descending from 750 meters above sea level to 250 meters below it in a few hours of walking. It is a geographical free fall of 1,000 meters towards the lowest point on the face of the earth. But what makes this route the most frightening of antiquity is not the tiredness of the legs, but the smell of iron that permeates the air. A smell that the locals knew all too well. The metallic aroma of fresh blood and oxidized earth. Welcome to Adummim, the legendary Ascent of Blood. For modern historians and archaeologists, this place is a proving ground for human endurance. But for those who lived 2,000 years ago, Adummim was the place where civilization ended and chaos began. The name itself should be warning enough for anyone. Why call a road the Ascent of Blood? The official explanation of archaeology points to the soil rich in iron oxide that paints the rocks a deep crimson red, giving the illusion that the mountains were washed in blood. However, oral tradition and accounts of the time tell a much darker story. The red of the stones was frequently renewed by the vital fluid of merchants, pilgrims, and peasants who underestimated the danger of the shadows. This route was the main artery between the religious center of the world, Jerusalem, and the luxurious oasis of Jericho. But this artery was constantly being severed. The terrain is a labyrinth of narrow canyons, deep crevices, and gorges where the echo of a scream can be heard for kilometers. But no one would come to your rescue. Walking through Adummim was like voluntarily stepping into a wolf's mouth. With every step, the temperature rises. The fresh mountain air of Jerusalem is replaced by a dry and scorching breath that rises from the Dead Sea, creating a natural greenhouse effect between the limestone walls. The moisture disappears from your skin in seconds, and your throat begins to close before you even reach the halfway point. But while you struggle to breathe, the true danger is not in the air, but in the hundreds of caves that pierce the slopes, like black eyes watching your every move. In these caves live the ghosts of Israel, the Sicarii. They were not common highway robbers who just wanted a few coins to eat. They were history's first precision terrorist organization. The name Sicarii comes from the Sika, a curved dagger, small enough to be hidden in the sleeve of a tunic, but sharp enough to separate a vertebra with a single blow. They were experts in ambushes in blind spots. The Jericho road is famous for its sharp, elbow-shaped curves. You turn a stone corner expecting to see the rest of the road, but what you find is absolute silence. And it is in that silence that death acted. The Sicarii attacked from above, jumping from the rocks, or emerged from behind in groups of 3 or 4. They took no prisoners. In that time, your clothing, your pair of sandals, and even the small leather pouch you carried were worth more than your life to a desperate man or a political rebel. Jesus did not choose the setting of the parable of the Good Samaritan by chance. When he spoke of a man who went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, he was using the greatest collective trauma of his audience. Speaking of the Adummim road to an inhabitant of Judea was like speaking of an active war zone. Everyone knew the body of someone who had been left behind on those stones, stripped and covered in wounds, exactly like in the biblical account. The red soil of Adummim was not just a geological curiosity. It was an open-air cemetery that had no graves, only the sun and the vultures to clean up the traces of the crimes. Biblical archaeology has unearthed evidence of small Roman guard posts and watchtowers that tried, unsuccessfully, to police this corridor. But how do you police a place where the stones have ears and assassins disappear into crevices that lead to the heart of the mountain? Roman soldiers hated being deployed to this route. They felt vulnerable, too heavy with their metal armor under a sun of 40 degrees, while the local bandits were light, fast, and knew every inch of shadow. For a soldier of Rome, Adummim was a hell of dust. For a Sicarius, it was the perfect chessboard. You are now in the middle of this dizzying descent. Your water reserves are at half, and you realize that you have not seen another living soul in the last 5 kilometers. panic begins to set in. The sound of a stone rolling high up makes your heart race against your ribs. Is it the wind, an animal, or the glint of the sun reflected on the bronze of a dagger? You begin to understand that time is not measured in hours on this road, but in heartbeats. If you cannot reach the walls of Jericho before the light disappears, you will face a type of darkness that the city never taught you. But before night comes, you will have to face an enemy that cannot be fought with fists or swords. An enemy that begins to cook your brain from the inside out and makes you see things that do not exist. Prepare yourself, because the desert does not forgive ignorance. And from here on, your journey through the road of death will test the limits of what the human body can endure before breaking. The sun is rising, the shadow is disappearing, and the delirium is just beginning. Do you think you could keep your sanity when the earth itself seems to want to devour you? What we will reveal in the next block is the biological secret behind the greatest temptations of the desert, and how thirst transforms holy men into wandering shadows. You have survived the first hour. Your eyes still search for reflections of blades in the crevices of the rocks of Adummim. But gradually, a new perception begins to take over you. The fear of being stabbed by a Sicarii begins to be replaced by something much more primitive and inevitable. The air you breathe no longer brings relief. It feels like sandpaper scratching the back of your throat with every inspiration. You have just entered the domain of the invisible executioner of this desert, the midday sun of Judea. In those times, there were no precision compasses or air-conditioned rest stations. If you made the fatal mistake of underestimating the thermal power of this region for just 60 minutes, your journey of 27 kilometers would cease to be a crossing to become a desiccation while alive. To understand what Jesus and the travelers of that time faced, we need to look at the science of survival from a visceral perspective. When you descend towards the Jordan Valley, you are entering one of the deepest geological depressions on Earth. The heat there does not dissipate. It gets trapped by the limestone walls, creating a convection effect that transforms the gorge into an industrial oven. The temperature easily rises to 45 degrees Celsius, but the thermal sensation on the bare rocks can exceed 55 degrees. What happens to the human body in these conditions is a biological metamorphosis of pure horror. First, your cooling system collapses. Sweat, which should evaporate and cool your skin, disappears so instantly that you do not even feel that you are perspiring. You are losing liters of precious water without realizing it, and this is where the desert begins to steal your sanity. Imagine the thirst, but not the common thirst we feel after a walk in the park. We are talking about biblical thirst. Your tongue begins to swell inside your mouth, becoming rough like a camel's leather. Saliva disappears, replaced by a bitter and dry paste that makes the act of swallowing a painful task. If you do not have access to a water reserve of at least 6 or 7 liters for this short journey, your blood begins to thicken. The heart needs to beat with enormous force to pump this dense fluid through your veins. With every step you take on the scalding stones, your internal temperature rises. When your body's core reaches 40 degrees, the proteins in your brain begin to suffer a process of thermal degradation. In archaeology and history, we often hear accounts of travelers who had sacred visions or demonic attacks in the desert. But modern medicine gives us a much darker explanation. You are suffering from cerebral edema caused by extreme heat. Delirium is the final stage of the sun's trap. When the brain begins to swell against the walls of the skull, reality fragments. The heat waves emanating from the ground create mirages so perfect that the exhausted traveler sees oases, palm trees, and water fountains where only stones and dust exist. You begin to hear the sound of running water, the call of familiar voices that are hundreds of kilometers away. Many bodies found on desert routes in antiquity were located far from the main trail, indicating that the traveler, in a state of thermal psychosis, abandoned the path to chase an illusion that led him straight to death. The famous temptations reported in the desert by ascetics and prophets have a deep physiological basis. Isolation, hunger, and principally severe heat stroke transform the desert into a stage of hallucinations where the devil and angels seem as real as the sand under your feet. Jesus knew this fragility. He knew that the human body is a vessel of water that the Judean desert tries to empty every second. The discipline required to walk kilometers under this sun without panicking is something that our generation, accustomed to thermal comfort, can hardly conceive. Every movement needed to be calculated to save energy. Every crack of shadow under a protruding rock was treated as a sacred sanctuary, where the traveler huddled for 10 or 15 minutes to try to lower the heart rate before continuing the calvary. Death by heat stroke is not fast. It is a slow agony, where you feel your senses shutting down one by one, starting with peripheral vision and ending in total loss of consciousness. If you stopped walking because of tiredness, the sun would have no mercy. If you drank all your water too fast, the thermal shock could paralyze your kidneys. The road of death demanded perfect biological management. But there is a detail that most historians forget. The heat did not only attract human delirium, it also dictated the behavior of the beasts that inhabited this region. While you struggle not to faint under the blinding light, you realize that the shadow is not just a refuge for you. It is the hiding place of predators that evolved to hunt exactly what the heat weakens. You are now at the point of no return. Jerusalem is just a distant memory at the top of the mountain, and Jericho is still a blurred promise on the horizon. Your body aches, your mind wavers, and every time you close your eyes to blink, it seems harder to open them again. The desert is winning the battle against your will, but do not be fooled by the absolute silence of noon. The desert is never empty. As the sun begins, very slowly, to descend, the hierarchy of the food chain begins to change. The invisible enemy of heat has given way to enemies with claws and fangs that the Bible mentions, but that time has erased from our modern memory. Prepare your heart, because what we are going to reveal in the next block will destroy the romantic image you have of the wildlife of the Holy Land. Do you think the greatest danger was snakes and scorpions? You could not be more wrong. When the temperature drops just a few degrees, the true owners of those mountains come out to hunt. And if you are too weak to run, you will cease to be a traveler, to become prey. The sun finally begins its slow descent towards the Great Sea, and for a brief moment, you feel an illusory relief. The temperature drops from 45 to 38 degrees, and the air seems less solid. But in the Judean desert, the end of extreme heat does not signal the beginning of safety. It signals the changing of the guard of the predators. If during the day, your greatest enemy was the sun and the metal of the Sicarii, the twilight awakens an ecosystem of nightmares that time and modern urbanization have erased from our collective memory. When Jesus and his disciples walked these trails, they were not surrounded only by sheep and doves of peace. They were traversing a territory that was, literally, the final frontier of colossal beasts. For the traveler of 2,000 years ago, the sound of a branch breaking or a stone rolling at the bottom of a canyon was not a nuisance. It was the sign that something, with hundreds of kilograms of muscle and sharp claws, was deciding if you would be the next meal. The first of these biological ghosts is the Asiatic lion. Today, we associate lions only with the African savannas. But in antiquity, these majestic and terrible felines dominated the entire Middle East, with a frightening concentration in the Jordan Valley and in the forests around Jericho. The Asiatic lion was slightly smaller than its African cousin, but possessed a shorter mane and legendary aggressiveness. Imagine being in a narrow gorge of the road of death, with visibility reduced by the long shadows of the afternoon, and hearing the roar of a lion echoing on the limestone walls. The sound is projected as in a natural amphitheater, making it impossible to identify where the attack will come from. The biblical accounts of David fighting lions or Samson facing the beast were not poetic allegories for the audience of that time. They were public service warnings about the real dangers of walking along the banks of the Jordan. These lions hunted by ambush, hidden in the dense vegetation near the rare water sources, waiting for exactly the traveler who, exhausted by heat stroke, lowered his guard to drink. But if the lion was the king of the plain, the high and rocky parts of the Jerusalem road belonged to the Syrian brown bear. This is one of the most terrifying creatures that ever walked the Holy Land. An adult Syrian brown bear could weigh more than 300 kilograms. Unlike other bears that can be avoided, the Syrian variant was known for its extreme territoriality and explosive temperament. They inhabited the same caves that travelers used to escape the sun or the rain. Imagine entering a deep crack in the rock in search of a moment of shadow and coming across a female bear protecting her cubs in total darkness. Archaeology has found traces of bones of large mammals in these caves that prove that the conflict between humans and bears was a bloody and frequent reality. Against a bear of this magnitude, a linen tunic and a wooden staff were useless defenses. You were, in every sense, easy and slow prey. While the lion and the bear represented brute force, the Judean leopard was the master of invisibility. These felines, which still have rare descendants in the region today, were the ghosts of the trade routes. The leopard does not roar, it watches. It can follow a caravan for kilometers, moving along the ridges of the mountains above the road without ever being detected. They waited for the moment when a traveler strayed from the main group, perhaps to adjust a sandal or to attend to a physiological need. The leopard's attack is silent and fulminant, focused on the nape or the throat. Many disappearances on the road of death, attributed to demons or bandits, were in reality the work of these spotted hunters who disappeared into the darkness before the first scream could be completed. And below these apex predators, there was the army of opportunists. Striped hyenas and golden jackals formed a constant shadow behind anyone who dared to walk alone. They did not have the courage of the lion or the strength of the bear, but they had infinite patience. The hyenas of that region had a bite capable of crushing camel bones and were known for following travelers debilitated by fever or thirst. They waited for you to fall. They followed your trail of sweat and blood, emitting howls that sounded like distorted human laughter, breaking the silence of the night and destroying what remained of your mental stability. The desert is not just a place of silence. It is a place of predatory sounds that inform your brain every second that you do not belong in that place. Walking the Jericho road was like crossing a gauntlet of teeth and claws. Jesus and his disciples lived in a constant tension that most Bible readers today ignore completely. Nature was not a pretty backdrop for prayers. It was an adversary that demanded absolute respect and total vigilance. Every step was a negotiation with death. And the most frightening thing is to think that, even surrounded by these beasts, the human being still managed to be the most dangerous predator of all. Fear was constant, and survival depended on a combination of instinct, luck, and an unshakable faith that you would not be the next carcass to be cleaned by the vultures under the sun of Adummim. If you are fascinated by this brutal journey and want to understand how archaeology and science reveal the darkest secrets of the biblical world, you cannot stop here. What Jesus faced on these trails goes far beyond what any movie has ever shown. If you value this type of deep content and want us to continue unearthing these truths, take this moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your subscription helps keep this search for real history alive without filters. And prepare yourself, because the daylight is ending for good. What happens when total darkness swallows the road of death is a psychological test that few modern minds would withstand. In the next block, we will enter the realm of living darkness, where the sound of a rolling stone can mean the end of your journey. Are you ready for what hides in the pitch black? The last thread of golden light has just disappeared behind the jagged ridges of the mountains of Judah. Anywhere else, the sunset would be a moment of contemplation. But on the road of death, it is the audible signal of a sentence of isolation. If you have not yet reached the gates of Jericho, or found the refuge of a fortified inn, you have just entered a realm where your eyes, your most valuable survival tool, become almost useless. You are about to experience what the ancients called living darkness. In the first century, without the existence of lampposts, electric flashlights, or the residual glow of modern metropolises, the night in the Judean desert was not just dark. It was a solid, black, and impenetrable mass that seemed to have its own weight on your chest. In this depth of pitch blackness, your mind begins to play cruel tricks. The phenomenon that modern psychology calls hypervigilance becomes your default state of consciousness. Since you cannot see beyond 2 or 3 steps in front of you, even with a resin torch that flickers dangerously in the wind, all your other senses are sharpened to the limit of pain. The silence of the desert is a lie. For the solitary traveler, or for the small group of pilgrims, the desert at night is a cacophony of invisible threats. The sound of a small stone rolling on a slope 50 meters away sounds like the rumble of an avalanche in your ears. Is it the wind? Is it a leopard positioning itself for the fatal leap? Or is it the cautious step of a group of robbers who waited all day in the shadows to attack when you were most vulnerable? The thermal contrast is another enemy that begins to assault your body. The Judean desert is a place of violent extremes. That oppressive heat of 45 degrees that almost cooked your internal organs during the day gives way to a cutting cold that descends from the mountains. The dry air does not retain heat, and in a few hours, you go from hypothermia to the risk of hypothermia. Your tunics, now damp with cold sweat, stick to the body, stealing the little heat you have left. Your teeth begin to chatter, and the accumulated muscle fatigue of 20 kilometers of steep descent makes every movement a Herculean effort. It is in this state of physical exhaustion and sensory terror that the importance of caravans becomes a matter of life or death. In that time, traveling in groups of dozens or even hundreds of people was not a social choice. It was the only insurance policy available in the survival market. The caravans that Jesus and his followers frequently joined were complex and highly organized organisms. They possessed a hierarchy of their own, with guides who knew every crack of the Adummim path and armed guards, often mercenaries or men from the community itself, who watched the flanks of the group. The sound of a caravan moving at night was a mixture of whispered prayers, the rhythmic beating of the hooves of pack animals, and the creaking of wicker baskets. For someone inside the circle of light of the caravan's torches, there was an illusion of safety. For someone watching from the outside, from the shadows of the caves, the caravan was too big a target, but also too dangerous for a thoughtless attack. However, even the protection of a caravan had its psychological limits. Imagine the weight of responsibility of a father trying to keep his children close in a single file line in the middle of the night, knowing that a false step off the trail could mean a fall into a precipice hundreds of meters deep. Accidental falls were responsible for as many deaths as attacks by beasts. The Jericho road is full of treacherous unevenness, where the constant erosion of winter rains creates unstable edges. In the darkness, the ground that seems solid can crumble under the weight of a man in a second. The desert at night becomes a topographical minefield. But there is something even deeper that afflicted travelers of the first century during the night: the absolute loneliness of the spirit. In the mentality of the time, light was the presence of the divine, and darkness was the hiding place of chaos. Being on the road of death after sunset was being in a territory where the laws of civilization and organized religion seemed suspended. The fear was not just of being killed or devoured. It was the fear of disappearing without a trace, of becoming a forgotten soul in a gorge that never saw mercy. The wind howling through the limestone rock formations created sounds that resembled human wails, feeding stories of travelers who went mad before even seeing the lights of Jericho. The night in Adummim was an endurance test for the human mind. Sleep was a dangerous luxury. Those who traveled in smaller groups needed to establish watch shifts, where the man on guard needed to fight against the weight of his eyelids and against the paranoia that every shadow moved by the wind was an enemy. The constant stress of staying alert for 12 hours of darkness consumed the body's last reserves of glycemic energy. When the dawn finally began to paint the horizon on the other side of the Dead Sea, with shades of purple and gray, the traveler did not feel joy, but the exhausted relief of one who survived one more round of a deadly game. You are now in the last third of your journey. Jericho is closer, but your endurance is at an end. However, while you fight against physical tiredness and the fear of predators of flesh and bone, another layer of terror begins to emerge. For the people of Jesus' time, the desert was not just a physically hostile place, it was a spiritual war zone. As the shadows of the night lengthen and exhaustion opens the doors of your perception, the fear of the physical gives way to the fear of the supernatural. And what inhabited the ruins and deep caves of Judea, according to the belief of every person who stepped on that road, was something that no sword could stop. Prepare yourself, for now we will enter the realm of Azazel and discover why the desert was considered the headquarters of the forces of darkness. You have already walked for almost 20 hours. Your body is a mass of pain and exhaustion, and your mind, battered by sleep deprivation and dehydration, begins to float between reality and nightmare. But for a traveler in the times of Jesus, the greatest danger of Adummim was not something you could touch or wound with a blade. As you delve deeper into the most remote gorges of the Judean desert, you enter a territory that, in the cosmology of the first century, did not belong to men and not even entirely to God. You have just crossed the invisible border into the realm of Azazel. For the mind of the man of antiquity, the desert was not an empty space or just an arid ecosystem. It was the headquarters of the forces of chaos, a place of exile for evil spiritual entities that hated the light of civilization. To understand the psychological load that weighed on the shoulders of those who crossed the road of death, we need to unearth the deep beliefs of the archaeology of Semitic thought. In the sacred calendar of the Jewish people, there existed a terrifying annual ritual, the Day of Atonement. In it, a goat was chosen to carry the sins of the nation and was sent alive into the desert, dedicated to Azazel. But to where exactly was this animal taken? Tradition points to the brutal cliffs that surround the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. The desert was not just a setting for this ritual, it was the receptacle of impurity. The traveler who walked there believed piously that he was stepping on soil saturated with curses accumulated for generations. Every dark cave you passed was not just the hiding place of a bandit, but the possible den of a Shedim, territorial spirits that, according to popular belief, inhabited dry places and abandoned ruins. This spiritual pressure created an atmosphere of terror that modern science often ignores. Imagine the psychological state of a pilgrim who, besides watching the surroundings for leopards and robbers, needed to whisper prayers and clutch amulets every 10 steps. The desert was seen as a place of testing, a concept that permeates Jesus' entire journey. When the biblical texts narrate that Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted, the audience of the time understood that he was going into enemy territory, to the personal battlefield of the adversary. The absolute loneliness of Adummim, combined with the echo of the rocks, created the perfect setting for spiritual paranoia. If a sudden gust of wind raised a cloud of dust in the shape of a whirlwind, that was not seen as a meteorological phenomenon, but as the manifestation of an unclean spirit trying to blind the traveler. This spiritual vulnerability was aggravated by the physical condition. As we discussed earlier, heat stroke and exhaustion opened the doors to auditory and visual hallucinations. However, for the man of the first century, the concept of heat hallucination did not exist. If he saw a shadowy figure at the top of a cliff that disappeared in the blink of an eye, or if he heard laughter coming from the bottom of a dry wadi, that was a real interaction with the invisible world. The fear of being possessed or receiving an evil glare from a desert demon was so paralyzing that it could lead to physical shock. The heart, already overloaded by the effort of the walk, often failed under the weight of this metaphysical panic. The desert was the place where your soul was as exposed as your skin under the sun. Furthermore, the landscape of Adummim is punctuated by ruins of ancient fortifications and forgotten tombs. For the sensitivity of the time, any structure built by human hands that had been claimed by the desert became the property of unclean spirits. Passing by these ruins during the night was considered an invitation to disaster. The sound of owls and hyenas, which we described in the previous block, was interpreted as the scream of these entities. The traveler felt that he was being hunted in 2 dimensions simultaneously, his body by natural predators and his sanity by supernatural forces. This duality transformed the crossing of 27 kilometers into a mental calvary that few survived without deep psychological scars. Jesus and his followers walked through this realm of shadows with an acute awareness of these dangers. When Jesus taught about the unclean spirit that comes out of a man and wanders through arid places seeking rest, he was using a geographical and spiritual reference that his listeners knew from personal experience. The desert was the home of what was unwanted, what was unclean, and what was dangerous. Crossing the road of death was, therefore, an act of spiritual warfare. You needed to keep your mind focused and your faith unshakable, for any hesitation could give an opening for the fear of the desert to consume you from the inside out. Now try to imagine yourself in this scenario. The sun is beginning to give the first signs of life on the horizon, but you are still enveloped by the shadows of the mountains. You are at the limit of your endurance. The weight of the fear of Azazel and the beasts of the night still crushes your chest, but the light is returning. However, the end of the journey brings with it a final revelation. What you learned on this road of blood and demons is not just a lesson about the past, but a mirror of human resilience in the face of the impossible. Your journey is about to end, but the question that remains is, how did this experience transform all those who, like Jesus, dared to face the road of death? In our final block, we will gather all the threads of this brutal story and discover why, even 2,000 years later, the path of Adummim continues to be one of the greatest mysteries of archaeology and faith. The dawn finally breaks the horizon line over the mountains of Moab on the other side of the Jordan River. For the traveler who survived the road of death, this first ray of light is not just the beginning of a new day. It is the sign that the Calvary of Adummim has been left behind. As you descend the last rocky slopes, the air begins to change. The smell of dry dust and sulfur is replaced by something that seems impossible after 24 hours of hell. The sweet perfume of dates, the freshness of running waters, and the invigorating humidity of an oasis. You are entering Jericho, the city of palms. But you do not enter the same way you left Jerusalem. No one crosses the Ascent of Blood and remains the same person. Biblical archaeology teaches us that this road was much more than a transport route. It was a rite of passage, a trial by fire that separated the strong from the fortunate. Looking at historical records and excavations that revealed the foundations of ancient inns, we realize that survival on these trails was the ultimate proof of human resilience. Jesus did not use the Jericho Road in his teachings because it was a picturesque setting, but because it was the place where human fragility and the brutality of nature met in the rawest way. Walking on those stones was a declaration of courage. For the people of that time, every journey successfully completed was a reason for a sacrifice of gratitude in the temple. For they knew, with a clarity that we have lost today, that life is a tenuous thread that can be cut at any moment by a blade, by a beast, or by the simple heat of a merciless sun. What remains today of the road of death are silences and ruins. Modern tourists can travel stretches of this route in air-conditioned buses, observing the reddish mountains through glass windows, without ever feeling the panic of a moonless night or the weight of a thirst that devours the soul. However, for those who seek historical truth, the stones of Adummim still scream. They tell stories of caravans that disappeared without a trace, and of solitary men who, moved by unshakable faith or desperate need, defied the leopards and the Sicarii to deliver a message or a load of goods. The history of humanity was written with the sweat and blood of those who had no other choice but to keep moving forward, even when the desert seemed to want to devour them. The resilience of those who lived 2,000 years ago is what allows us to be here today, telling this story. They faced the realm of Azazel, the claws of lions, and the fury of the sun, so that the routes of trade, culture, and spirituality remained open. And it is here that our documentary journey comes to an end. But your exploration is just beginning. Now that we have traveled every inch of this terrifying road together, I want to hear your voice. If you were transported right now to the year 30 of our era, standing at the top of Adummim with only a staff and a leather pouch, which of these dangers would make your heart stop first? Would it be the real and tangible fear of the dagger of a Sicarii hidden in the next curve? Would it be the invisible and predatory presence of a leopard or a Syrian brown bear lurking in the dark? Or would it be the psychological terror of facing the shadows of the desert alone, in a place where evil seemed to have a name and an abode? Write here in the comments what you felt upon discovering this brutal reality. We read every comment and want to know how this perspective changed your view on the stories you have heard all your life. Often the history we are told is sanitized, but our goal here is to unearth the naked and raw truth, without filters. If you appreciate this type of deep investigation, if you like to feel the tension of real history and want to continue unraveling the greatest mysteries of biblical archaeology and human survival, you need to become part of our community. Click the subscribe button now and turn on all notifications. Do not let the algorithm decide what you will learn. Choose the knowledge that challenges your mind. Leave your like if this video made you see the ancient world with different eyes. This is fundamental so that we can continue producing documentaries with this quality and depth. And do not stop here. What else do you wish to explore? There are secrets at the bottom of the Dead Sea, mysteries in the walls of Babylon, and enigmas in the sands of Egypt that we have not yet touched. What is the next location you want our team of scriptwriters and archaeologists to investigate? Leave your suggestion below. Your curiosity is the fuel for our next great expedition. Thank you for surviving these 24 hours with us on the road of death. Your thirst for knowledge is what keeps history alive. See you at the next mystery, at the next frontier, in the next documentary. See you soon.